Hey, Ben Osterhouse here. I'm a cellist, and I've been developing sample libraries since 2019. In this video, I'll be giving you a walkthrough of Cello Textures Evolved. It's a redesign of the very first sample library I released. The original cello textures consisted of complementary articulations designed to be layered together to create unique gestures and add splashes of color to your music. Everything was laid out in a big canvas, so you could easily mix and match textures together, playing them forwards, backwards, or looped. The new interface lays these same textures out, but it has way more playback controls and effects. The original interface included a randomization button. The new interface takes this much further, providing randomizing buttons all around the interface. So with a few clicks, you can easily take the original samples far beyond the sound of a solo cello. Cello Textures Evolved uses the same recordings as the original cello textures, but re-edited and improved. Starts, ends, and fades have been redone, as some samples were cropped too tightly. The samples have all been denoised to get rid of hiss. They've also been declicked since there were some slight audio glitches I found. They've been retuned to fix pitch drift and some errant corrections from before. I added a few notches here and there to remove some ringing and boominess, a bit of gentle high passing over everything as well. In 2019, I normalized all the samples individually, but it sounds more natural to normalize groups of samples at a time so that their relative volumes are maintained. So let's look at the texture canvas. There are 4 types of articulations. Bite is a quick, sharp staccato. Accents are staccato too, but they have a more gentle, expressive attack. Fast swell is pretty self-explanatory. It's more dramatic than the slow swell. Slow swell is long and drawn out. Each articulation has 3 different styles. Cloud style was done by either playing fingered harmonics or soltasto. Soltasto is when you play over the fingerboard. They're fluffy and full of air. Wires is a good word to describe what's known as ponticello playing. In this style, the bow was drawn close to the bridge, quickly scraping over the surface of the string to create a metallic sound. Soil is used to describe normale playing, a healthy, grounded sound created by playing halfway between the fingerboard and bridge with a full vibrato. As you've seen so far, once a texture is turned on, it's surrounded by a frame with more options, kind of like a clip in Ableton or Logic. You can click or drag along the bottom to set the sample start, reverse the samples, or turn on the loop. Once the loop is turned on, you can drag on these handles to set the loop's start and end. You can also make it do a back and forth loop. Click the top bar to select a texture for editing, or shift and click to select multiple. If you have lots of tiles turned on and you don't want to shift-click each one, you can select them all using the Edit All button. Tempo synced looping sets loops based on project time instead of sample time. Any texture with its loop turned on will show a grid, and the loop starts and ends will snap to that grid. The grid's divisions can be adjusted from the menu next to the tempo synced looping button. Normally in a sampler, you set loop points and they stay in the same place in the sample. If you play higher or lower notes, the loop goes faster or slower. If you do want to keep it from going faster or slower, you have to use time stretching. The problem with time stretching, though, is that it can introduce artifacts, and it's also pretty CPU intensive. Besides, it sounds more interesting to play back samples faster or slower because it changes their format. So the idea behind the tempo sync looping in cello textures is that it's dynamically moving the loop points around depending on your project BPM and how many beats you set the loops to. You can click the titles to select all textures on a row or column. This works exclusively turning off all other textures. You can hold Shift while clicking titles to add or subtract textures though. If all textures on a row or column are already turned on, clicking the titles will turn off that whole row or column. You might notice that the keys are colored purple and blue. Each texture has its own recorded key range, but then it's stretched so that you can play as low or high as you want. Purple keys show for where any texture sample will be stretched. For example, if you use the clouds accent, the blue keys go from C3 to C7. Outside of that, in the purple range is just playing the C3 or C7 samples at different pitches. If you use the soil accent, the blue keys go from C1 to C5. But now if you turn on the clouds accent too, the blue keys will cover the range that the two textures have in common, which is C3 to C5. Of course, if you've adjusted the tune knob on any textures, some stretching will happen no matter what. Below the texture canvas, there are 4 tabs. The Textures and Modulators tabs can be used to adjust the sound of individually selected textures, and the Shaping and Space tabs are for global effects applied over the whole mix. You can shift-click a tab to pop it out on top. Say you're adjusting the reverb send amount on the Textures tab, but you want to adjust how the reverb sounds too. You could avoid switching back and forth so much if you shift-click the Space tab to pop it out on top of the Textures tab. All the controls in the Textures and Modulators tab will show the value of the last selected texture as shown with the yellow outline. Let's say you've turned down volume on one texture, then selected another one. The volume knob now shows an asterisk, which indicates that if you try to change it, the other texture's volume will be brought in sync with it, erasing the value it had. Let's go over each of the controls in the Textures tab. Volume can help mix textures better. For example, if one texture is looping over its softest part and another is looping over its loudest part, you could balance their volumes. Dynamics controls the amount of velocity to volume. This can make a big difference in how textures sound through compression and distortion. Pan can be useful for creating a wider stereo image. You could layer a few textures together and pan each of them differently maybe. Transpose changes the pitch by playing notes higher or lower. Tune changes the pitch by playing samples faster or slower. It can be tricky to be precise when changing pitch using knobs, so arrows on either side make it easier to tweak the knobs by one semitone at a time. Dots surrounding the knobs make it easier to jump to different octaves. The link is useful for shifting formants. If you change one pitch control, the other goes the opposite way. This makes the sounding pitch always match the played pitch. You can increase attack to soften hard starts. This can be especially useful if you've set the sample start partway through. Release works as you'd expect. Note though that the envelope is retriggered whenever a loop point is hit. This means that if you turn up the release, the sound won't get cut off right away when it loops around. You can use these attack and release times to make loops more seamless. Saturation is per voice. This means that voices won't crunch into each other. Per voice saturation can be a great way to turn an acoustic sound into a synth sound. If saturation is preamp, then when a texture's volume is changed via modulators, the volume knob, or velocity, that change will not affect how saturated the sound is. High pass and low pass are two-pole filters, so they're fairly steep, and they happen before the saturation. There's only one global delay in reverb, but each texture can send a different amount to it. Note that the delay and reverb are routed in parallel rather than serial. This means the echoes from the delay won't have reverb applied to them. Moving on to the Modulators tab. Each texture has its own envelope and LFO, and each texture can map controls to the mod wheel differently. The modulators each have a destination section where you can control how much the modulator affects knobs in the Textures tab. There's a lot of sliders to look at here, so to make things easier, they're color-coded. Say you're on the Textures tab and you want to modulate the low-pass filter. You can just flip over to the Modulators tab and look for the purple sliders. If you want to make it even easier, you can shift-click the Modulators tab to pop it above the Textures tab. Now, say you want to modulate the low-pass filter with the LFO. You drag to the right and... why isn't it changing the sound? Well, that's because you're adding to the filter's cutoff, and it's already all the way up. You can't add any more. So if you pull down the filter knob, then push up the modulation amount on the LFO, you can hear it working. The envelope controls are pretty standard and self-explanatory. You can choose from 5 different LFO shapes, or make your own by clicking the edit icon. This opens up a panel where you can draw shapes or click the dice to generate a random shape. If you turn the phase knob, it will show where in the shape the LFOs will start when you trigger a note. The LFO frequency can be free running or synced to beats. Free running I find is useful for making slow oscillating shapes, while synced LFOs are great for creating sequenced patterns. If retrigger is on, every note you play will have its own LFO. If retrigger is off, every note shares the same LFO, which gets reset on the first note you play. By mapping the mod wheel to different destinations for different textures, you can turn the mod wheel into a very expressive control. For instance, if you want to make it so that as you turn the mod wheel up, the sound gets more edgy, you could click the clouds accent and the wires accent, make the mod wheel affect volume for both of them, and then draw in different custom curves so that they fade into each other as you move the mod wheel. Another example, say you wanted to make the mod wheel add more attack to the sound, you could turn on the soil, bite, and accent, then make the mod wheel fade the bite sound in. You could do a lot with this. After tweaking a texture to your liking, you may wonder what its settings would sound like applied to a different texture. You can do this thanks to the copy and paste buttons found on the left side of the Textures and Modulators tabs. You can hear this one has a lot going on. Here's this other texture, but with no effects. Pretty dry. Now I'm going to go back to the first one, copy its modulators and paste them. And copy its texture controls, paste them there. And now the slow swell will have the same effects that the fast swell did. You can copy and paste between instances of Cello Textures too. Next, let's talk about the Shaping and Space tabs. The Shaping tab contains a tube compressor and an EQ. It shapes the tone and dynamics of the overall mix. Super GT is a combination of saturation and compression. Saturation in the Textures tab was applied per voice, but Super GT's saturation is applied once over everything, so different notes can crunch into each other. During development, it was questionable whether an EQ was really needed. It's plenty convenient to use your own outside of Kontakt. For the sake of the presets though, it's nice to have things already EQ'd a bit. In some cases, there were obnoxious frequencies sticking out in the mid-range, and in other cases, boosting the highs and lows could accentuate what's most interesting about a preset. The Space tab contains a delay and reverb. In the Textures tab, there were send amount controls. The reverb and delay on the Space tab are what all those sends go to. The reverb uses Realm, which has 3 modes. Grounded focuses on rooms, Airy mode on halls, and Cosmic on abstract spaces. The new Cello Textures interface was designed for randomization. Let's first look at the dice for randomizing the textures canvas in the upper right corner. If you click the drop-down menu next to the canvas dice, you can adjust what gets randomized. Say you choose which textures, it will pick a random set of textures for you. If you choose sample starts, it'll randomize all their sample starts. Note that it will only randomize sample starts for the selected textures. This way, if you wanted to only randomize sample starts for some of the textures, you could do that. If you choose loop ranges, nothing happens. Oh, and that's because you need to turn the loops on first. Yeah, it'll only act on textures whose loops are turned on. The loop modes option means it'll either turn the loop off, turn it on, or turn it on and set the loop type to back and forth mode. Forward and reverse, as the name implies, randomizes playback direction. If things get too crazy and you just want to start over, you can always click the handy reset button. Along the bottom, there are more dice buttons, one for each tab. One important distinction when randomizing the Textures and Modulators tabs is that each selected tile will be randomized independently of all the others. So if you were to select a bunch of textures, click Edit All, then click the dice, you'll see that each texture's knobs have a completely different set of random values. Okay, so we've covered the 6 dice buttons so far, but there's a 7th one hiding in plain sight. If you hover over the title, you can see it's clickable, and when you click it, the entire interface gets randomized all at once. The sound you get after that, I mean, who knows what it'll be. You might want to turn your volume down before playing though. What's going on when you click the title is that it's ticking all the boxes in the top dice's drop-down menu, it's randomizing the tempo sync looping, and then it does the equivalent of pressing all 4 dice buttons along the bottom. All the randomization has been restricted to reasonable ranges, but it certainly hasn't been fine-tuned to the point where you can get a usable sound every time. If you want sounds that have been shown more care, try the presets. Presets can be loaded as either snapshots from the contact header or as NKIs from the presets folder. In the presets folder, you'll also find accompanying MIDI files for each NKI marked with a recommended BPM. For each preset, certain ranges or chords can sound especially good, and I wanted to show that using the MIDI files. As you browse the presets, be sure to try the mod wheel. It'll do at least something to the sound. Also, try turning on different texture tiles for each preset. Their texture settings and modulators have all been set to be complementary, even though they're off. The Chaos Lab folder is included to show some of the interesting results that can come from playing around with the randomize buttons. As such, these presets are not carefully refined like the other ones. Well, that covers everything in this new version of Cello Textures. As you can see, it's packed with features, and there was a lot to explain. Because of that, I decided not to include demonstrations in the walkthrough video. So if you'd like to hear what all of this sounds like, then take a look at the presets videos.